Now, I forgot to put on my hat. And when I arrived, Shane had just bought his top hat. And I said, that's funny, I've got one in the car, which I always bring to festivals. And he said, you know what the origin of the Mad Hatter story, and I'm sure many of you know this, but I'd sort of forgotten. And he pointed out it was because they put mercury in the lining of the hat, which of course was a very good way of sending people a little bit loopy. Then of course we started putting it in our teeth, which was a really clever idea, until relatively recently. And there's an extraordinary statistic in relation to that. Something like 14% of the mercury in the food chain comes from the amalgam fillings in cremated bodies. So that's a pretty weird one. But it also allows us to sort of segue very clearly into this whole notion of altered state. And I know, as those of you who heard Shane's fantastic stand-up yesterday will know that psychedelics have had a profound impact on his life in a very healing and beneficial way. And I can reiterate certainly that for myself and many others that I know. And although it's been a very taboo subject for 50 years, it's really coming back into our current sort of lexicon, and there's a new wave of research. This sort of psychedelic renaissance is going on. And I think that has huge ramifications for our understanding of consciousness. And for me, most importantly, in terms of promoting this sense of what E.O. Wilson called biophilia, which is this knowledge or this innate sense of being part of nature and the natural world. So I would like to just launch in, following on from Shane's talk yesterday, or his stand-up about psychedelics, and just ask him how he feels that his psychedelic experiences, just to lead us into this conversation, have changed or impacted his idea of what consciousness is.
Yeah, so this is wonderful and interesting. So I'm actually a stand-up comedian. I've been a comedian for 15 years. I started getting into science communication halfway through my career, and I started a science podcast called Here We Are 5 years ago. I interview a lot of life science stuff, a lot of how the brain works, a lot of psychology, neuroscience, sociology, behavioral economics, animal behavior, and that sort of stuff. And so I guess I have a few fundamental, just to give you a sense of who I am and these kind of fundamental turning points that are relevant to where my perspective on this comes from. So I'm from like a small rural conservative town in Wisconsin, and I had a very strict religious Catholic upbringing, which I rebelled against from a very early age, and so I have through much of my life found any ideas of spirituality and mysticism a bit triggering, and then I became a teenager and started doing psychedelics and really took to them. They were just the most fantastic experiences I'd ever had, and really mind-opening and altering, and just revealed to me at the time just how it was really validation for how weird and strange this existence is. That was kind of being dismissed by any time I had a question about what this life is all about. It was just like, oh, God did it, and then kind of dismissed. And so then I wanted to be a comedian since I was about 9 years old, got into psychedelics, started comedy, was a traditional comedian, and then got into the science stuff. And so I always had psychedelic material, and then I developed a show about psychedelics as a way of introducing people into science ideas, because a lot of people are adverse to science stuff, especially in the United States, and talks of evolution and that sort of thing. And so I used psychedelics as an inroad to talking about perception and consciousness, because people love hearing about drugs. And then that became this unexpectedly successful tour. I didn't actually know people would be interested. I became known as a psychedelic comedian, which really wasn't anything I set out to do. And now I get to do weird events like this and get asked. And when I was asked to come here, I was asked to, I assumed I was just doing my psychedelic show, and then I one day looked at the website and they're like, Shane Mauss is giving a talk about consciousness. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm giving a talk about consciousness, which I have never done before, but I have talked about consciousness, and I'm sure we'll get along just fine. I do find myself in many situations in my life experiencing, each week I go in and talk with a scientist who's much smarter than I am, and especially in the area of expertise that they have, and I suffer from quite a bit of imposter syndrome all of the time, which, if you don't know, imposter syndrome is when we're trying to do kind of an ambitious task, we often feel like we're going to come up short, or people are going to find out that we're a fraud or whatever. And it's this pervasive thing throughout humanity. Even scientists who study imposter syndrome are like, who am I to study imposter syndrome? It's kind of this inescapable thing. But if anyone is going to take a wild stab at whatever consciousness is, it might as well be an idiot in a top hat. So here's how I look at consciousness, and it's quite a bit different than how much of the psychedelic community talks a lot about universal consciousness and manifesting and these sorts of things that I find to be a little triggering, but I think they're cueing into something that I would articulate in a much different way. But how I think about consciousness and how I like thinking about it, so basically, in a number of psychedelic experiences, I've experienced these same things that you hear in reports of going to these different worlds, interacting with different beings, seeing these different lights and kingdoms and stuff like that. A lot of people think you're going into a different dimension, something like that. I think that you're actually gaining access to just aspects of your own inner world. A lot of people would call subconscious or unconscious. I find those to be. I think saying subconscious is like saying it's like below consciousness, or unconscious is like you're knocked out, or non-conscious is like, oh, it's just this other thing. And I think that we oversell what consciousness actually is. And so I guess for the time being, I'm using inner worlds. And I think you're gaining access to the inner worlds, and these inner worlds are feeding consciousness to you. So your consciousness, in my perspective, is I'm big into evolutionary psychology. It's a lot of flaws to it, but a lot of people think about evolution as just like, we learn to stand upright, we have imposable thumbs, terrific. But also evolution has shaped the way our brains, the way we are attracted to who we're attracted to, the way we make the decisions that we do, the reason why we dress up rooms in these overly ornate, ridiculous fashions that we're very proud of and pat ourselves on the back for. While chastising other people for wanting material things, but I think that how I kind of view it as what I think maybe consciousness is something that is, to me, it must have some evolutionary value, and probably it is assessing, it is specific to each one of us, even though I think we are all connected and have this human nature or whatever. I do think that each and every one of our consciousness right now is doing something very different to the environment we find ourselves in. The environment not being like just the chairs in the physical reality, but the social environment. So we all have many different roles right now. Host, guest, speaker, whatever, you guys are the audience, so there's a lot of different things going on right now. Rory right now, I would guess his consciousness is filled with a bunch of ideas and questions that he's probably thinking of as I'm talking right now. And we don't know what questions those are going to be until they come out of his mouth, and then we'll know, oh, that was a thought that he had on his mind. But I intellectually know there's probably a little more going on than the actual thing that comes out of his mouth. And I think there's a similar situation going on between the relationship with the inner worlds and our conscious experience. So Rory's going to use a set of criteria to figure out the questions that are relevant to move this talk forward, and it's going to be based on a number of things. And you guys, you're thinking about maybe how your day went, and then you're evaluating my perspective and the worth of it. Was this worth standing in line for this long? There's a number of criteria you're using right now, and then you're associating with what I say with things that you already know and trying to make sense of what might be new information or maybe ideas that you've already had. And the idea is why does our inner worlds provide the ideas that it does at the time that it has? If you're all sitting around having lunch after this, you might be having a conversation about sports. You might have something really interesting to say about trains, but why would you say that? We're all talking about sports right now. And because a sports thing to say would have value in that conversation, you will be primed to have more sports ideas to start with. So we all have this plethora of information in our heads, but only some of it is relevant to the environment and the situation. And I think that when we tap into those inner worlds in a psychedelic experience, you lose that limiter, what we call the ego, or whatever some people call the default mode network, which is kind of selecting. We all wear these many hats in life. We all are sometimes a speaker, sometimes a listener, sometimes an audience, sometimes a parent, a child, a coworker, whatever. And you have to take on that role, and I think that those roles are all stored within our minds in this complex system of perception that we normally don't have access to. It's a little like a dream world, but I think that those inner worlds are being used to store memory and to help us aid decisions. I think right now in split-second timing, there are simulations of possible ideas and things that I could be saying right now, and my inner worlds are projecting things to say out of my mouth. And I don't have a lot of inner talk going right now because my mouth is opening and I'm talking, and so it's just like, just go, just fucking keep going. And until at some point I'll be like, this is time to stop, hopefully soon. And but what my consciousness is doing right now is different than what your consciousness is doing. It's taking in, it's looking at you and like, okay, are people interested in this? How are they responding? Is this getting through? So my consciousness is taking in, it's in this kind of feedback mode right now. And what I'm accessing is past, I've had other talks about conversation in the past, and I've had other ideas of how this might go that I was rehearsing, like, going for a jog or something like that. I'm like, oh, I'll talk about this when I talk about consciousness in Port Eliot. And that was stored away, and I'm now accessing it. And I think that is a lot of how the brain works, and I think that if we started looking at it in that way, it could mean for some pretty interesting breakthroughs. But I think that the reason why it looks so when you have a psychedelic experience and say like smoke DMT and go into that world, so I basically think of the inner world. Have you seen the movie Inside Out? Like, it's a fun little children's representation of the brain. This girl has these 5 little characters that represent her emotional state in her brain. And it's a wonderful film, overly simplified version of what I'm trying to talk about. But I think that's a nice little model for how the brain works. Such a good film. I want to see a sequel to it called Outside In, where that little girl as an adult does a bunch of LSD, pops down into that world, and she'd come out being like, oh my God, there's like this sad God and this joyful God and all these different worlds, and they're being constructed and falling apart, and I saw my own imaginary friend from when I was a child. And it would sound just like me or most people having a psychedelic experience. And I think that's what we're tapping into, and I think that I could provide some insights in that world. But I think that when you're in there, what it absolutely does look like is that you are talking with gods and beings and spirits in all of these different worlds. It's just not my perception of what's happening after the fact. Mind you, haven't done a psychedelic in a while. If I were to sit here and smoke DMT in front of all of you, I'd be like, scrap everything I just said. I just got a message from an alien, and it's definitely the truth. But, that's what integration's all about, is dialing that back down. So that's my kind of basis, simplified, believe it or not, way of how I think about what consciousness is doing. So I think of consciousness as more of a perceived, I think of it as an approximation of reality, and not even, it's an approximation of a biased version of reality, which is usually self-serving, and often used to. And I don't know what I'm talking about totally, right? But me me even saying that makes you trust me more. This is what's called, I'm telling you not to trust me, and there's something like inherently like, oh, all right, well, I trust this guy then. This is actually called the disclaimer effect, and it's this happens with used car salesmen and stuff like that, where you say like, well, I have incentive for selling you this thing, so remember that. And you, the customer, don't discount enough, and because I've said, well, I'm kind of full of shit, that allows me psychologically the liberty to oversell what I know even more. So that's a lot of how fickle I kind of perceive a lot of reality. I think we're just riddled with many of these biases, and egocentrism is probably the main one. And yeah.
Great.
All right.
Yeah. No, good. No, but I think, but it's a good point to sort of follow on with what I wanted to say, because I think it's very important to have a very clear shared definition about this word, because for most of us, the worldview we've been educated in and indoctrinated to believe, which is this sort of materialist, reductionist view, pretty much makes the brain, the mind, and consciousness all synonymous terms. And what I brought up in a lot of the talks for those who come to these before is that the increasing amount of evidence that consciousness isn't this epiphenomenon of the brain, that it's not some emergent property that comes about because of complex neuronal firing inside your skull, but is something actually much more fundamental to the universe and the nature of reality, what the Buddhists call the ground of all being. I'm particularly influenced by the non-dual traditions of things like Advaita Vedanta and Taoism, but also massively supported now by many scientists, philosophers, transpersonal psychologists, etc. There's a man called Bernardo Kastrup, who I'm particularly interested in at the moment, who's writing incredible books, one called Why Materialism is Baloney, where he really does a very, very good job at dismantling the materialist paradigm. So, and one of the analogies he uses there is that this egoic, personal sense of identified consciousness is rather like a sort of vortex whirlpool within water, where if you imagine consciousness with a big C, as it were, and by that I mean the sort of totality of being, the entire frame within which all of this manifestation appears. For anything to appear, everything is dependent on consciousness for it to appear, for its observation. So, and we're so identified with this personal egoic sense of consciousness, with being the whirlpool, forgetting that we're possibly actually the water itself. And this is where a lot of this sort of confusion arises. And I think, I can fall back on this quite interesting bit of deductive logic that you can't be the mind or the body, because there's something there that can observe both the mind and the body. So ipso facto, you must be something else for there to be an observer and that which is observed. That might just sound semantic and silly, but I think there's actually something to it. But also this notion, we're so preoccupied with language and words, and we so believe that nothing is real unless it can be explained or understood in language. And he, rather than the subconscious, he uses this term, the obfuscated mind, which is basically that which is always there when there aren't any words, the gap between thoughts, which mindfulness and meditation is taking you towards, that which is there in the state of deep and dreamless sleep. And this is the ground of all being. This is conscious, when one's identified with the background, with consciousness itself, with the totality of being, that is the state of the sage, I would say. That's my understanding of the enlightened state. The identification with the mind and the body has dissolved and has moved to the background. It's like the foreground's gone to the background's gone to the foreground. So what I'm ultimately, in a rather long-winded way, coming around to asking Shane is, your position on this notion: is consciousness something generated by the brain? Is all of this, when we smoke DMT and have contact with aliens and entities, and we are in this dimension that appears to be even more real than this reality, or feels like coming home. These are very common experiences within the DMT state. Is that all just something happening? Is that just aberrant neuronal firing? This is what a materialist reductionist would explain all of this away as. Or are you actually accessing some other dimension. Is the brain, like, as Aldous Huxley said, a reducing valve in the same way that the eye can only see certain spectrum of light and the ear can only hear certain frequencies of sound? Is it possible that the brain is actually just, as Huxley thought, a reducing valve that reduces this overwhelming amount of information to just that which is pertinent to the current situation? And what the psychedelic state does is open up the portal to these other dimensions. So, sorry to babble on, but first of all, is consciousness generated by the brain or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, you bet it is. And second, I actually, most people would disagree. Especially within like the more new agey or wellness community or anything like that, they would. This universal consciousness stuff is all the rage right now, and I think there's a lot of stuff to it. But the idea of us being like an antenna that's tapping into this bigger thing, that's sort of the way that I see things in terms of like these mimetic environments that we live in, and that our lives can be influenced by ideas and smells and all these things that we can't perceive. But I think that this universe is independent of your perception of it, and I think that I mean, you are absolutely right that language certainly muddles a lot up, and I think that language actually influences. Language becomes an environment that then manipulates consciousness. So when we talk about, we use all these things, this embodied consciousness ideas, this field of research that's happening that is just absolutely wonderful and mind-blowing to me anyway, which is the idea that you call someone hot, you don't mean that they're warm, you mean that you find them attractive. You call someone blue when they're sad. They're not physically blue, they're sad, but you call them blue. And you call someone, no problem, getting rushed over here. This is on the universal consciousness spectrum coming to attack me. Someone can seem distant when they're standing right next to you, and the reason why this is from a modern academic point of view, and most modern academics, by the way, don't actually you don't hear them talking much about universal consciousness, let alone consciousness. So if I go in and ask a neuroscientist, if I'm like, what is consciousness? They're like, pass, no thank you. Which is, I think, one of the wonderful things that scientists do is they say, I don't know. And that is, consciousness is often the trick of explaining what happened after the fact. So actually, let me tell you just a quick aside. My brain can be a little bit all over the place. But here's a fun story of how consciousness works. So when I was a different, more traditional comedian, I for a while sold these beer mustaches. They're little plastic mustaches that clip on a beer bottle. You drink the beer bottle, hey, you have a mustache. Isn't that cute? And sell these things after a show. It's a good way to make a couple extra bucks. It's not easy being a comedian, so you make money in any way that you can, right? So I got these 8 different colored beer mustaches, and if you're going to get into the beer mustache game, what you're going to find out in a hurry is that black is going to be your #1 seller, followed closely by pink. But after that, it's a grab bag, and I could prime people to select different colors based on different things. I could be like, Christmas is coming up, make sure and get a green and a red one, clip both of them on, and I could sell more red and green ones after the show, right? But then, after a while, I would be sitting on like a bunch of purple beer mustaches, and this is one of the more depressing points in a comic's career, when all your hopes and dreams have amounted to you with all of your assets sitting in a huge bag of purple beer mustaches that you can't seem to unload on anybody. How are you going to get rid of these things so you can eat? Well, what I used is a little bit of my marketing and behavioral economics knowledge, and so I had all of them in these little like a tackle box, basically, and they're all in these little compartments, and then there'd be like 20 in each little space. but I took I put the purple ones in the center, and then I took almost all of them out, so there'd only be 3 left. This triggers what's called the law of scarcity. If something seems scarce, it seems valuable. Ooh, I don't want to miss out on a purple mustache. This is one of the best ones. This must be very popular. I better get myself a purple mustache. And next thing you know, these purple mustaches are flying off the shelves. People are buying them up. I'm just taking one out of my pocket and replacing it every time they do. And here's where the interesting things comes in. I would always ask people, why did you pick the purple mustache? I know why they picked it, but I would ask them, why did you pick the purple mustache? And no one would ever say, I don't know, because that's not what consciousness does usually. We all come up with answers for things. They would be like, oh, well, my daughter's favorite color is purple, or I had a car that was purple, and they would, bullshit, I hadn't sold one of these things in 3 months, and now they're flying off the shelf. You're buying them because I tricked you into buying them. I know exactly why you're buying this thing. And it's not like a smart or a dumb thing either. Smart people also would buy the purple mustache. They would just have fancier stories of why they bought the purple well, you see, purple used to be an expensive dye to make, so it was always associated with royalty and wealth, and that is why I chose a purple beer mustache. Oh, really? Fancy pants? By 10. And so much of what consciousness is a bullshit explanation of why we behaved in the way that we did after the fact. It's just the story that we're telling ourselves. Back to why we often are talking about the things in how language, we use the physical reality to articulate our inner experience. Part of the reason why that is because the cortex, the part that was the last evolved, that came after, it's responsible for all this fancy language stuff and a lot of our self-control and impulse stuff, the stuff that makes us very human. But it was built on top of our limbic system. It had to be built on top of something, and the limbic system does more of the 5 physical senses. There's actually more than 5 physical senses. There's like senses of balance and everything else, but let's just talk about the greatest hits. And it was built on top of that, and what had to build explanations for things based on top of those 5 senses. So now we talk about like, oh, we're having a deep conversation right now. Well, what's that mean? How can a conversation have depth? How can an idea in the brain be big or small? It's not changing any neural firing. Why do you want to get high? Why would up be good? Probably because we evolved to fight against gravity. I don't know. You don't want to go down. You don't want to feel down. You want to get down for some reason, but only to put your hands up. But the point is, this stuff is insanely complicated, and yes, much of it is not. Language is a flawed way of articulating much of what's going on in our inner world. But the point is that I believe our environment, including language as an environment, our social environment, many of the other things that we can't feel or smell or touch or anything else, that I would call an environment of an idea that your brain is in, is manipulating consciousness, and consciousness is the story of what's going on. So if you have last example that I thought of recently, and this is probably total bullshit. I haven't run this by anybody to fact check. Usually I take these grand ideas that I have during a psychedelic experience, and then I go and talk to neuroscientists who are like, nah. And I haven't had a chance to do that. But when 2 hours before you wake up, cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, starts releasing in your brain. That's if you're not a depressed person. But if you're a normally functioning person, cortisol will start releasing in your brain to start waking you up. And I think this is why people have nightmares. So you go into REM sleep, and consciousness all of a sudden finds itself in an environment of neural activity that is flooded in the stress hormone cortisol. Your amygdala is on fire, and your prefrontal cortex is inhibited in a dream state that is impairing your ability to perceive reality. And so it's coming up, a nightmare is just the story of the essence of what that environment feels like. I think much of consciousness is a metaphor, and much of if you're standing in line and you're frustrated because you want to get the cup of coffee or crumpets or whatever you guys are into, there's more insulting stereotypes you can have about people, all right? But you're frustrated and you're like, oh, and you have a vision quick of you punching somebody in front of you. I don't think that anyone actually wants to punch someone. I don't think that would serve you or them or anybody else. I think it's a metaphor. I think it's your inner world communicating to you in almost like a game of charades. Like if I was trying to play charades and I picked the word anger out, I'd be like, trying to get you guys to guess that. Now, anger is much more nuanced than that. And you can't even perceive when someone's angry most of the time. But if you want to get the point across that I'm feeling angry right now, that's what you want to do. And I think that's much of what our inner worlds are trying to do to us when we have these conscious ideas. And I think the importance of understanding that is when you have suicidal ideations or something like that, you can realize like, oh, that's not actually, I shouldn't actually go and kill myself. That's a metaphor. That's my brain saying, if I stay on my current trajectory, I am slowly killing myself. And I think that that having more nuanced interpretations of what our inner worlds are trying to say to us are a way to better understand these experiences.
Brilliant, because that also leads directly into what I was wanting to sort of follow on with is this preoccupation with language and the notion that truth can only be sort of defined within this notation that we've evolved over time, and that anything that occurs in the absence of language, i.e. the intuitive mind, is what has been sort of subjugated and disregarded increasingly over the last sort of 200 years since the advent of this new sort of scientific paradigm, this sort of materialist reductionist paradigm that came out of Newtonian Cartesian thinking. And sorry, where was I going with that? Yeah, so I think Bruce and I were very influenced when we made this for Bruce Parry, this film Tawai, by the work of a guy called Ian McGilchrist, who's written a fantastic book some years ago called The Master and His Emissary, and it's really about the left-right brain hemispheres and the extent to which the left hemisphere has become very dominant during this period of the last 200 years, and this is the very sort of analytical, rational, sort of masculine hemisphere, and the more intuitive, feminine, and more systemic, holistic sort of systems view of things is what has been subjugated. And there's much to suggest that part of our current predicament is because of our obsessive preoccupation with the left hemisphere at the expense of the right. So I think, that again, that we disregard these, we're led to sort of believe that anything that arrives intuitively, i.e. in the absence of language, is somehow not true. And I think that's possibly a massive failing. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I find, I was so happy to sit in and see Bruce's talk just before mine because, as someone who is I'm really big into evolutionary thinking and thinking about deep time, and I think one of the things that we really need to start addressing and having bigger and bigger conversations about is the mismatch between the environment that we evolved in and for and the environment that we currently find ourselves in, and the pros and cons of that. But there are some drastic changes from the people estimate that humans have been around, like if you were to take a time machine and go back and grab a baby and bring one here and raise it, and would it pass as just like any one of us, they think bare minimum 75,000 years, but they think at least 200,000 years, and some people think about 1 million years that humans have been around, not to mention all of the things that led up to becoming human. And so now there's all sorts of, like the advent of agriculture and I mean, birth control is like this amazing, fantastic thing that has all these incredible benefits. And then on the other side of it, we never had birth control in our evolutionary history, and so now we're having sex and babies aren't coming out, and it's potentially, there's an idea of a mate rejection hypothesis where our brains are going like, what's wrong? Why aren't babies coming out when we're having sex? You're with someone for a year or so, and these psychological mechanisms start going off like, oh, there must be something wrong with it, and then you start picking away at your partner and finding flaws in them. You'll find that usually happens around 18-month period or so. And again, that's not a proven hypothesis, but it's an interesting one. And so there's a lot of mismatches with that, and I do think that we are incredibly adaptable and flexible, and I think we can use that to our benefit, but it can be really detrimental. From a personal standpoint, I used, this happened to come up, it doesn't matter. I got into comedy, wanted to tell some silly jokes and whatnot, and did that. And then this is a common path with comedians, is you get on stage, you tell some jokes, ha ha ha, everyone laughs, terrific. And then one day you're having a bad day, and you go like, you get on stage, you're like, my neighbor was an asshole, or my spouse did this or that, and then people are like, that's like, it's very genuine. It's this part of of ourselves that we don't normally get to express because there's a lot of social pressure to be positive all the time and all that. And people really resonate and respond to that. And then an audience responds to that thing, and then you're a comedian and you go, oh, all right, well, I just got rewarded for that. And then you're like, I wonder what other twisted shit I could share with people. And then you start mining for that until you eventually take on this archetype of this sad clown or whatever, because and I don't think that it's a conscious effort to do that. I think that when you get rewarded for that, your subconscious is going also, this is depressing about life. Also, here's another thing that's like filthy and no one likes talking about. And then it becomes like this weird exhibitionist thing on, so look at all my naughty stuff. And you get rewarded for that, and then you kind of become this, a lot of comedians are these sad, miserable people. And that's just one little example from one like nothing personal experience. When you take an incredible flexible species that was, as Bruce is saying, egalitarian through, for the most part. I mean, I don't equality. I think it was. I think that the structures of indifference were more nuanced in our hunter-gatherer ancestors. I think there was still status and people wanting status and whatnot, but much more nuanced than that. But now you take it and you have everything super saturated. Now we can have the most, you can take like what used to be a little stimulant in a cocoa leaf that used to help you hunt, and now you can grind it up and snort it up your nose. Whoa, now it becomes a little problematic. And I think that we kind of do this with status, where now, I mean, the difference between the top guy in a hunter-gatherer tribe and the bottom guy in a hunter-gatherer tribe was like, this guy's a little better at hunting. Whereas now it's like having a mansion to being homeless. These are incredibly, and then within that, we're creating all of these new social roles that there's a lot of pressure on us to act out. So even if we say, don't want to talk about sports because, God, who gives a fuck? But that's what everyone's talking about, and you want to be a social person, that's what you find yourself talking about. We do that, and there's a lot of, so what I think a lot of the value in the psychedelic experience, and what I imagine, I've never lived with hunter-gatherers, I don't know enough about them, but I imagine they explored a little more of the palette of the emotional system experience than we do. I think that because of our current economic structure and job structure, there's so much pressure to be happy and to be a cheerleader all of the time, that we end up telling ourselves this story that life is just about happiness, and that we got to be this happy person all of the time, and don't appreciate all of the other wonderful aspects of life, including the darkness. And I think that because we're focusing on these little bits of life, and then taking them to the extreme, and like basically turning everything into a drug. You take something like what used to be someone who could juggle or something like that, and like, that's a cool trick, and you expand on it, and now we have this massive cinema experience where now to get the same rise out of someone as watching someone juggle, you need like 80 explosions and cars flying through buildings, and it's just so ridiculous and cartoonish and unhealthy, and missing out on so much of the rest of it. And I think that is part of the benefit of what the psychedelic community would call the disillusion of the ego, which me or someone like Amanda Fielding, who was on, might call just the default mode network being inhibited, so all of the experience is able to be seen and
unfiltered.
Unfiltered.
Yeah. So, just one point about Bruce and the hunter-gatherers. The important point, and I'm not an anthropologist, but the important point there is that the Penan were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and and there's only like 300 of them left, and they're now being settled. So something happened in the transition from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to being hunter-gatherers and then settled societies. But on this notion of the evolution of consciousness, which I'd like to talk more about and think about, where we might be at within that, because I come from this sort of non-dualist kind of perspective.
By the way, Rory didn't know I was just going to get up here and argue with him the whole time. He thought I was.
No, I knew we were going to have wonderful, it's good. So the notion, I appreciate there's definitely an apparent evolution within consciousness, obviously, and obviously within our own personal sense of consciousness. And I'm sure you maybe, or some people here, I'm sure are aware of the work of Ken Wilber, who's one of the sort of leading transpersonal psychologists in the States, an incredibly bright man. And he's got all sorts of sort of spectrums or models of consciousness, which you could imply to us as a species generally, but also I think to us as individuals. And so, if we look at us as a species, clearly, someone like Karen Armstrong wrote a fabulous book about 10 years ago called The Great Transformation, about this era around 500 to 800 BC, around the time of Confucius, the Buddha, Taoism, ancient Greek philosophy, across the globe at the same time. From what we can tell, was the first appearance of this notion of self-reflective consciousness. We became conscious of being conscious. That was obviously a massive step. And what I'm proposing is, what I'm hoping, is we might be coming close to a next potential shift. And what that might be, I would suggest, is a collective leap to this more non-dual understanding and recognizing that this egoic separated state is only a part of the picture, that ultimately, in essence, what we really are is fundamentally deeply connected with everything. And consciousness is ultimately all there is. I mean, I know that's sounding very wacky to some of you, but also that is certainly what a lot of scientists in the sort of quantum physics arena are saying. And actually, I have talked to neuroscientists about this, and in one who came to Tyrion, where for the last few years I was holding all of these small symposia and conferences around psychedelics and consciousness issues and ecological issues. And this guy got up and he said, look, really, within 5 to 10 years, it's going to be untenable for any scientist from any discipline to maintain that consciousness is generated by the brain, because the weight of empirical evidence is going to get so overwhelming, you're going to see this massive shift within the scientific community. And what I'm really hoping is when that happens, because we take our information from the scientific priesthood, as Thomas Kuhn called it, that the trickle-down effect on our economics and our politics and our sense of being and how we relate to each other and everything could be profoundly affected. And I think that could be possibly the thing that is necessary to save us as a species and much of life on Earth. Anyway, that's something else. But also just then to apply that to the individual, anybody who's had children will have observed this, and I observed this with both of my sons. The ego manifests usually around the age of 2.5, and that's why we talk about the terrible twos. And I observed this with both my children. You told them in front of the mirror when they were under 2 years old and go, who's that? And they go, baby. And 6 months later, you told them in front of the mirror and you go, who's that? Oh, that's Sholto or Zan or whatever their names are. Suddenly, this identification with consciousness emerges. And so in the Ken Wilber model, we emerge from this oceanic, boundless state of consciousness, which is the state of the infant, and then progress into this egoic sense of state of separation. Now, what the mystical experience, or maybe the psychedelic experience sometimes, profound experiences that may come out of a meditative practice or whatever, is the collapse of that identification and the remembering that what you actually are is consciousness itself. So, where I'm going with all of that is where do you think, as a species, we're going in terms of that understanding? And if one was to apply Ken Wilber's model about where we are individually as a species to the species as a whole, there is a lot to suggest that that may be the trajectory we are on. The problem I think a lot of us have about the concept of this, and I think an awful lot of sort of wishy-washy New Age sort of stuff is happens in this area, because it's very hard to understand the notion of oneness, because we always leave ourselves out of the equation. Yes, everything is one, apart from me, if you know what I mean. We find it very hard to actually have that totally inclusive experience of oneness, because as soon as you've articulated it, even internally, verbally, even as soon as you said, I am, internally, you've already created a state of separation. You've already gone into dualism. And this whole manifestation is dependent upon that dualism from every structure, from a subatomic structure, and this is what's there within all these ancient Eastern traditions, the Shiva and the Shakti, the manifest and the unmanifest, right through to, say, a philosopher like Kant in the 19th century who coined this term, the noumenon, as opposed to the phenomenon. This is the phenomenal manifestation, but on the basis that there are no one-ended sticks and there is an equal and opposite to everything. The opposite of this manifestation and the phenomenal state is this noumenal state, or the plenum, or the void of the Buddhist tradition. It's that which is there in deep and dreamless sleep, and out of which all of this may have emerged. I mean, that's the sort of philosophy behind that. So, sorry, once again, an awful lot of stuff. But please just sort of pick up on any of that.
I'll do an awful lot of stuff as well. I think that the theory of mind, which is often that the other things have a mind of their own, that's developed at a certain age in humans, is tested by the mirror test, often in other mammals as well, and they'll put on like a little orange dot or something on a different primate and see if it itches at it or whatever when it sees itself in the mirror, to know if it understands that it's it. In fact, it's not just humans that can do this. Rhesus monkeys have about the smallest brain, and scientists were skeptical that a rhesus monkey would have this theory of mind idea, and so they placed their bets, gave the rhesus monkey a mirror. It had never seen a mirror before, takes a mirror, once right away recognizes itself. Step number 2, let's take a look at these balls. That was within 30 seconds of the discovery of the mirror. That is what primates were doing with it. So the point is like, I don't know how much we might be making too much of this theory of mind stuff, is all that I'm saying. And I think that we're not the only organism that has it. And I certainly, I guess some of my issue with some of, so one, I guess I've never understood a explanation of quantum physics, despite trying to understand it. And it's my understanding that even quantum physicists don't know what quantum physics is or how it's working. But it seems like throughout my history that of dealing with just human nature is that people are looking for any hope to tell us ourselves a story that we don't die. And you can go like, well, the universe is actually 11 billion years old, not the 10,000 years like the Bible said. And people will be like, well, where did the universe come from? And I'm like, well, we don't know. And they're like, haha, see? Therefore, Jesus. What? No, that's not, it doesn't mean that Jesus was a real thing or was resurrected because we don't know where the universe came from. And I think that sometimes this happens a little bit in the New Agey community where it's like, hey, we can never know everything exactly, and therefore anything's true. And anything can be true. We might be living in a simulation right now, which I kind of believe. We might be living in a matrix. This might be one of an infinite number of lives that we have, which is a horrifying idea to me. The idea that sounds nice to people is, I mean, I've seen that in my own head. I've lived 1,000 lifetimes on a DMT trip in 5 minutes. It's not the most pleasant thing in the world. I mean, if anything's possible, an alien could be fucking me in the ear right now, and that's what's making the words pop out of my mouth. If we're just saying whatever we want to say, but you know, science has done a really nice job of finding these little approximations. Has been guilty of reductionism for sure, and science is also very self-correcting. Is also hyper aware that they have a replication crisis on their hand, and are using the scientific method to understand what's going on wrong with it. And to correct it, which mysticism isn't like being like, hey, maybe we're a little off here. How can we correct this? They're going like, I saw the truth, and now you must all listen to, usually men, mind you, and status, once again. And so I'm always a little skeptical, and I always feel like such an asshole questioning it. I think that there's a lot to it. I think that people should never take life as face value in any way, and I think that we like understanding empathy and knowing where other people are coming from is a tremendous benefit. I don't think that we'll necessarily be able to manifest our own, like everyone's like, oh, we're just going to explode into fractals of love or whatever, and I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I think that if a dung beetle was manifesting things, then everything would be dung. You know, if consciousness is this thing that manifests stuff, we'd all be living in a really bizarre, we'd be living here is where we would be living if consciousness was manifesting things, because that's what our inner worlds looks like, which is a dramatized version of reality. But I think that there's a lot of promise in understand, because when I run these ideas by scientists, I argue with scientists too, and they think I'm crazy. Scientists understand the level of the neuron doing this and that, and then some patterns here, and then they have some broader ideas of these sub-selves that we have for mate retention and mate acquisition and child rearing and kind of these, but you tell them that there's worlds inside of our heads, and they're like, no, that can't be true. And I think that our inner worlds are far more powerful and interesting than we realize, and if we spread awareness and understood them better, we could understand all ourselves more, and we'd understand that most of this is a dramatized version of reality. Much of what we're producing is, so I'm a rock climber, and when you learn to do the rope knot, you make a loop, you flip it around, you tie the rope around, you put the thing through the loop, and then you pull it. That's the first part. Now that's a hard thing to remember unless you use a dramatized metaphor of what's going on. So they tell you, you make a head, you tie a noose around it, you poke it in the eye, and you pull it through. Ooh, now I'm going to remember that. That just made an impression. And that's what we're doing. That's what much of our emotions and much of this delivery, the way, the material that I'm choosing to present, the way in which I'm using inflections is to make an impression on you guys. What you guys are, what you are taking in. Some of you are bored. Some of you are excited by it. You're having a myriad of emotions, and those emotions are tracking what I'm saying is worth keeping and reflecting on, and which is worth discarding. And it's going into your inner worlds in that same dramatized way. So as we try to express what's going on in our minds, in our inner worlds, what it looks like down there is much closer to what a dream state is, which can be You can be on a roller coaster, and then you can be under the sea in the next moment. And then there can be a monster there, and then you can be on fire, and then you can be falling, and it can change just like that. And that's what those inner worlds look like. And that's what I think when we meditate or do a psychedelic experience, the reason why it looks like everything and every possibility is because in our minds, it absolutely is. But I don't think that that changes. I don't think that any one of you in here can make this not be a chair, and I don't think that I think that that light is going into my eyes, and my pupils are dilating to regulate the brightness of my conscious experience. What I don't believe is happening is I'm manifesting a brightness that I'm projecting into the world. Otherwise, if I ate some mushrooms and my pupil dilated, well, you guys would all be blinded by the brightness I'd be projecting. I don't think that's how the world works, but I don't think... So all I'm saying is you have a psychedelic experience, and you come back, and you're like, that's amazing, and it's always... You take the best parts of it. That's what I have a problem with, is people taking the best or the worst parts of it, where they, like a lot of guys, you'll have a positive experience and not know it's your inner world. You'll be like, oh, I see it now. It's just about free love and spreading love everywhere and making love with everybody all the time. Free love, spreading love. You will notice that when like a young man has like a mystical experience and gets some message from God or the universe, it usually has something to do with how he should be using his dick more. It's in there, and this reveals some interesting and therapeutic things. An ex of mine had had this mom who's this, her mom is this gorgeous woman, wanted to be a model, it didn't work out for her, and she has all these insecurities about her looks, of all things. Of all the things, it's like her best trait, and of all the things, she's insecure about her looks. You know, we all have things like this that we do. She has all this ridiculous plastic surgery she never needed. You know, she's at the 0.1% of physical beauty by our standards or whatever, and that's the main thing she's focused on. And she was like, I did mushrooms once when I was in college, and I never again. I looked in the mirror the whole time and thought about how ugly I was. It's like, you were this close to getting the message. If you would have been in a therapist's office, a therapist would have been like, oh, that is a metaphor for your inner world, what your internal world is telling you about yourself all of the time, often needlessly, and is not reality. And if you knew that, you could, when that came up, you could be like, oh, that's not reality. I'm a gorgeous person, and of all the things that I could work on, that's not one of them. Instead, she blamed the mushrooms for it. And I think that we tend to take our conscious experience of reality a little too seriously. But my hope for creating a more universal consciousness, or whatever, creating conscious change in humanity, because humans are really good at creating these amazing ideas and having these shifts like you've been talking about, like, say, democracy, where all of a sudden a lot of people all around the world get on board with this new idea that may or may not work out, but it's so far so good-ish, and an improvement. So we have this capacity for these huge shifts, and I think the way in which we have these huge shifts, I mean, if you want to save the world, free condoms everywhere you go, a global initiative, that's how you help humans and save the world. But but on a more grandiose scale, you can also have these fun conversations where we can talk a whole lot more about more interesting ideas, and each provide our different points of view of what this existence actually is and what this consciousness actually is. And when you start doing that, you'll find that everyone kind of thinks about this stuff, maybe not in the way that I do or Rory does, but everyone kind of wonders about this reality and what existence is. And when you create an environment, when you create a social environment, when you go, oh, hey, I was listening to this podcast, or I saw this show, or something like that, and it gives you an inroad to talk about the things that you're actually interested in. And when you start doing that, people respond, and they start saying things that they're interested in, and it raises, it elevates the level of the conversation, and I think that that's not that hard to do. I find myself, I go back to my rural hometown now, and I go around all my conservative relatives who my grandparents, a little bit of my background, my grandparents have a photo with Donald Trump, which I'm sure they spent like $10,000 on some fancy dinner to support him. And when he got elected, they sent around a picture of that to everybody, saying that he is clearly, this is divine intervention, and this is a sign from God, and this is like the second coming of Christ. That's what they believe. And that's the environment that I was raised in. I go back to that environment, and those people know that I'm into thinking about evolution, and an idea that they never, ever would talk about or think about or would be actively against. And just because I'm there and they're making conversation, when like a dog's digging up a bone or whatever, they'll be like, why do dogs hide bones like that? Does that have some evolutionary thing to it? They just started having ideas about evolution just because of the new social environment that they found themselves in, which just happened to be me. And we can all do that for one another, and I think that we just need to get out of our comfort zone a little bit. I think that the reason why we have such small talk conversations is because we all want to relate, and it's really safe to have these very safe conversations. You can go up to anyone on the street and talk about the weather. That's nice. You can't go up to anyone on the street and be like, I've been thinking about killing myself lately. How about you? And it's harder to do. But if you actively kind of think about some inroads into talking about just the more elevated expressions, I believe that will elevate everyone's consciousness, because the environment that individual's consciousness will find themselves in will be one of an elevated conversation, and I believe it will rise to the challenge. I think that we're perfectly capable of that.
Fantastic. I'm afraid we've only got time for me to ask you one more thing, but just to sort of bring it back full circle and bring it back to drugs, which as you say, everyone likes to hear about. And I think we're just with reference, and this is an incredibly important thing, I think, especially when one's talking about these very powerful compounds that psychedelics are. But there are certain biologists and scientists and even evolutionary psychologists will say now that the fourth greatest biological urge is actually this desire to alter the state of consciousness, and one can witness this in children as well, spinning around in circles until they get dizzy, rolling down hills like here yesterday. So there's something there innately going on from quite a young age. Now, what interests me is at what point does this desire to alter consciousness and maybe use powerful psychedelic compounds, for example, become a legitimate a journey of self-exploration and potential self-improvement and therapy, and at what point does it potentially become an escapist thing which we regard as just being hedonistic and just not really dealing with the reality of here and now? And clearly some drugs are associated with escapism much more than others, but because they've been so controversial for so long, psychedelics, and because such a sort of bleak picture was painted about psychedelics following on from the 60s, and there's still a great overhang within our societies about that. I would just love to close with your thoughts about how do you see the pursuit of those substances in a legitimate sense, how you see that coming on stream over the coming decade, for instance, how you'd like to see that, and any ideas for anybody out here who's interested in going there, just how to sort of do this in a responsible and safe way, and not to basically repeat the mistakes of the 1960s.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the 60s were much a response to there were this extreme conservative, oppressive movement that were saying you shouldn't do any of this stuff ever, and so then the psychedelic movement returned, in kind, and was like, no, everyone should do them all of the time, and neither were true. This is just the nature of debating things and getting in your own little trench. But I think that this is, I'm about to sound like an optimist, and I'm gonna reflect and really throw up in my mouth later, because I don't have the most faith in humanity, to be honest with you guys. But I think there is room for some pragmatic optimism, and I think in terms of what we've been talking about, I think that with especially the advent of the Industrial Revolution, where now your value is in the ability to sit and make a widget. It's always widgets, by the way, but to like sit in a factory and turn out like the same. I've done a lot of factory work myself, and do the exact same repetitive thing over and over again. Show up at the exact same time each day and just do this mind-numbing. And I think that there was almost a real need or demand for some of these things like alcohol that really dim down the conscious experience, and speed. There's much of the meth crisis in the U.S. right now is rooted in factory workers losing their jobs and having to work longer hours in this mundane experience. And I think that we are entering an age of automation where we don't exactly know what the future of the job market is going to look like, and we're definitely going to have to be pretty flexible. And flexibility comes along with creativity, and flexibility and creativity are something that we lose with age, and flexibility and creativity are the one thing that psychedelics can absolutely do for you. Not always in the most healthy way, and I've gone way overboard with psychedelics. So I have a documentary about psychedelics called Psychonautics, a comics exploration of psychedelics. During the filming of it, I ended up in a psych ward because we were trying to film a whole bunch in a short amount of time, and I was not taking the amount of time to integrate that I normally would have, and also was getting a little cocky with the substances. So, nothing is 100% safe, and people can be arrogant and everything else, like I was. But if you want to do it safely, there's an organization in Jamaica that I work with called Myco Meditations, and I'm going down next January to lead another retreat. You can come down and eat mushrooms with me next January in Jamaica. It's a wonderful time, and people have really life-changing experiences. In terms of a global scale, though, it seems like it's just kind of happening. It seems like there's just so much, incentive from Silicon Valley. Ooh, you microdose and then you come up with a new app. And that's like so against the psychedelic experience in my impression of it, which is all about like having this fresh start and this reset and these new insights, whereas microdosing seems like, how can I be a more efficient worker? I don't know. How can I make more money? Seems like the opposite of what psychedelics should be about. But if it's a way to make some inroads, and I think that people are gaining more information in the U.S. Where the U.S. is with marijuana right now is pretty exciting and incredible from the area that from growing up in the 80s and the war on say no to drugs. How about just say no, thank you? If anything, why be a dick about it? But I think it's coming along, and I think, personally, that the most hope for global change is probably going to come from the scientific and research community. And it's unfortunate in a number of ways, because I would actually much rather have you come to Jamaica and eat some mushrooms with me out on the beach than sit in a lab and like with a therapist and have it be like this uber serious thing. I think there's actually more healing in having a more natural experience. But this is very sellable, that you can be like, hey, we're taking these veterans and these victims of sexual assault, the worst of the worst cases, and we are helping their dysfunction, and you know, these are the biggest users of the healthcare system, and they're treatment resistant, and we're able to help them. Who can argue with that? The veterans, for crying out loud. And think of the children. What if we can get the children with cancer, the CBD? And that's all great, and that's wonderful. We shouldn't even need the argument. We should all be able to be taking these substances if we want. But that right now, that is the argument that like needs to be made to move it forward, because it's the one that it doesn't matter how you know, it's very clever of the MDMA researchers to do this, because they can get on Fox News in the US, the most conservative network that is so anti-anything related to like progressive or wellness, anything, and they can go on and be like, well, the veterans were helped. They're like, the veterans? And they're moving MDMA forward. I think the sad part of that, and some of the sad part of therapy, which I think is absolutely wonderful, is the obsession with the negative and the trauma, which is great for us to work on and address. But I think it misses out on some of the fun and the wonder and the beautiful parts of life. And I like seeing some of this positive psychology movement that's coming out, as flawed and fickle as some of the research seems to be. I like the idea of it, and I think it's new and it will get its footing eventually. And I would love to see that interact with the clinical psychedelic movement. I think would be really, really exciting.
Fantastic, Shane. That's a wonderful note to end on. I'm sorry there hasn't been time for questions, but we started a bit late, and I know we've got to vacate the room for the next event.
I'll hang out outside and answer
Shane
all
will
the
hang
questions
out outside.
you have.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Shane Mauss.